My name is Amal Firdaus, and I will be giving a brief introduction on COVID-19, how it affects the tourism industry and the content of this research study. By late 2019, the world is struck by a devastating announcement of a global pandemic called COVID-19. Malaysia is no exception. Its first infection was connected to a cluster of acute respiratory illness cases in Wuhan, China, which further spreads in other countries. This outbreak had become a public health emergency of international concern and is then declared as an airborne disease by World Health Organization or WHO. As a result of this outbreak, especially in Malaysia, many sectors have been affected, with one prominent downfall is the tourism industry in Malaysia being most severely affected. Consequently, this also caused the economic growth in Malaysia to plummet down in its early and latter stages, forcing people into their homes without any income. As an example, Malaysia's annual tourism campaign, Visit Malaysia, has been devastated by the pandemic. This exposes a major risk to the campaign, with new and more dangerous COVID strains being discovered mainly in Asian countries, such as the Delta variant. This prompts the government to announce a movement control order, or known as MCO, which includes travel restrictions for both international and domestic flights. From a report written by NST, Malaysian government recorded losses as much as 3.37 billion ringgit within the first 2 months of the year 2020. It is also reported that travel and tour packages are being cancelled, which due to travel restrictions, which also affects other sectors such as the hotel sector and airline sector. Since the MCO has been and must be abide by law, all tourism activities are announced to remain freeze during this period due to a decline in tourism-related activity and interruption in international supply chain. This results in a substantial increase in unemployment. Therefore, the focus of this study is to study the impacts of COVID-19 on the tourism industry in Malaysia from an employer's perspective. The role of employers and employees, let alone, is not sufficient. Therefore, this study also approaches the different initiatives made by the government to aid the employers in sustaining large and small businesses to conserve the country's economic status. We have come up with 3 different research objectives, where our priority is to hopefully answer these 3 questions by the end of our research. In this research study, there are 3 research objectives that we must answer by the end of this research. Alongside is 3 hypotheses that we should verify or refute according to our findings. The first research objective is to evaluate the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the employers in terms of loss in revenue. Second is to identify the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the employers in terms of the ability to pay their workers on time. Last is to identify the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the employers in terms of government aid. For hypotheses, the first hypothesis is employers are not able to generate any revenue. Second, employers are struggling to pay their workers on time. Third is employers receive sufficient financial aid from the government in the form of cash aid.
Greetings everyone, my name is Muhammad Imran bin Mansor and I will be presenting the significance of this study and the research methodology section. Moving on to the significance of the study. Firstly, this study is conducted to help us to understand and grasp the situation better regarding the inevitable problems and difficulties faced not only by the employers but also the employees in facing COVID-19. Secondly, this study broadens and deepens the perspective of the impact of COVID-19 towards the people in the tourism industry on an extensive scale. Lastly, this research study helps potential stakeholders in formulating possible solutions by allowing them to understand the problems, causes and impacts from the pandemic towards the tourism industry. In this research study, we have chosen mixed methods, specifically quant-qual method in our data collection, which involves the combination of quantitative and qualitative research methods. Quantitative research in this study is mainly based on collecting and analyzing numerical data, where a descriptive research is conducted by distributing survey questionnaires towards 25 targeted respondents. Meanwhile, qualitative research in this study is oriented towards analyzing non-numerical data by reviewing and summarizing previous research on this study, In other words, we have conducted library research on the previous studies. As for the data collection, we have collected our primary data in this study by creating survey questionnaires comprises of 18 close-ended questions via Google Form and distributing it through online platforms such as WhatsApp and Telegram. The survey questionnaires consist of 4 question design, specifically demographic data, true and false questions, MCQ questions, and Likert scale questions. Meanwhile, our secondary data collection is being done by reviewing previous research made by credible authors, by summarizing 5 reliable published materials such as journals and articles through literature review. Moving on, this research study utilizes sampling technique in order to conclude the information related to the population regarding the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the employers in the tourism industry. The sample size of this research study is a total of 25 respondents, where all of the respondents comprises of people that work in the tourism industry. In addition, this research study has no limitations towards the demography, meaning that a more truthful and accurate data can be collected in this research study. Lastly, the quantitative and qualitative data analysis in this research study is carried out with the help of Microsoft Excel 2019 software, whereby the descriptive aspects of the quantitative and qualitative findings were demonstrated visually with the help of tables and graphs, alongside other descriptive statistical indicators.
From the demographic data of our survey, most of the business owners are around 41 to 50 years old and 51 and 60 years old. More than half of the respondents are female and most of them has an educational level of university, followed by college. Lastly, most of them are in the food, beverages and hospitality industry.
Hi, I am Fikri and I'll be presenting the analysis for the first research objectives, which is to evaluate the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the employers in terms of loss in revenue. So for the first analysis, which is the cancellation of reservation as a result of COVID-19, from the pie chart, we can see that 68% of respondents answered yes, while 32% of respondents answered no. This finding is justified since employers suffered losses during the pandemic as a result of expenses incurred when consumers cancelled their reserves. For the second analysis, which is the number of reservations cancelled as a result of COVID-19, from the bar chart, we can see that the majority of the respondents claims that they had zero number of cancellations during the pandemic, while only 4% of respondents claims that they had 14 number of reservations cancelled as a result of the pandemic. This finding deviates from the research question, however, it is still logical since most of the business of the respondent were located in a state where COVID-19 rules are more lenient due to the lower number of cases in the states. For the third analysis, which is on the employee's income status during the COVID-19 pandemic, from the pie chart, it can be seen that 72% of respondents earned some income but less than usual, followed by 24% of respondents claiming that they had lost all income. However, there is also 4% of respondents stating that they earned about the same income as usual. This is because even if the employer status revenue was plummeting during the pandemic, the employer was still generating some form of side money in addition to their primary income. For the fourth analysis, which is on the loss estimation in terms of revenue due to travel bans policy during the pandemic, from the bar chart, we can see that the majority of the respondents answered 5, where they had more than 50% of losses, whereby 4% of respondents answered 1, indicating that they had 0% of losses in terms of revenue during the pandemic. The finding here is logical, owing to the fact that as a result of travel prohibition legislation, fewer individuals will be able to travel from one location to another. As a result, people are unable to visit their favorite restaurants or stay in hotels in order to prevent spreading the virus. For the last analysis, which is on the COVID-19's impact on the employer business. From the bar chart, we can see that the majority of the respondents claims that the pandemic had decreased the demand for product or services, followed by 48% that claims shortage of supplies and difficulty in moving or shipping goods are the causes for their loss in revenue. And also 40% of the respondents claims that government mandate closure had brought a huge impact on their business. However, there is also 8% of respondents claims that the pandemic had increases the demand for the product or services. This could be due to the fact that their business is much more flexible because they use e-commerce or other online platforms to conduct the business, which makes sense given that the majority of the respondents work in the food and beverage industry, which means that they can conduct business in person or online. For the summary on the research objectives 1, the majority of the findings here is aligning with our research hypothesis, which is employers are having difficulty to generate revenue during the pandemic. However, there is also some findings that deviate with our research hypothesis. Therefore, the first research hypothesis is partially accepted.
Hi, my name is Amirul and Haqeem, and I will be presenting the summary of the second research objective. In the second research objective, we'll be studying the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on employers' ability to pay their workers on time. In the first two questions, the question related with the ability for the employers to pay their workers on time were asked in the online survey. Out of the total 25 respondents, 96% of them agree that it is difficult to pay their workers on time during the COVID-19 pandemic. This is most likely due to the loss of income. While the 4% answered with commission-based answer, indicating that their income is based on commission earned, which relies on the customer demand. Out of this number, 64% of the employers reduce their staff, while the other 36% remain and keep their staff number despite the pandemic. The high percentage of employers reducing their staff number is probably due to their inability to cover their salary expenses. To adapt to the current COVID-19 pandemic, changes to the employment and payroll for the employer's company are necessary. From the data collected, the highest response were decreasing worker salary, implemented by 56% of the total respondents. The other two highest response are decreasing working hours and laying off employees without payment. These two response were implemented by 44% and 48% of the total respondents respectively. The logical explanation for these changes is due to the lower demand and low volume of customers. Hence, lesser labor is needed to run the business. Furthermore, the lowest response obtained were hiring additional employees, increasing working hour, and laying off employees with payment. For some businesses, these changes may be more beneficial and more suitable depends on the company policy. To compensate the losses of income and pay their workers, some employers resort to several available options in order for their company to survive. One of the ways to compensate their losses, 56% of the employers took loan from bank in order to pay their workers' salary. Since bank in general is the easiest way to apply and obtain loan, it is logical that this option having the highest response. This is then followed by 40% of the respondents receiving aid and support from the government. On the other hand, only 8% of employers receive aid from the non-governmental organisation. This shows that the government has significantly aided more employers compared to the NGOs. Furthermore, 40% of the employers resorted to start a part-time job, and 36% sold their possession to gain extra income. This shows how severe the impact of the pandemic on tourism industry, until the point where business owners had to resort into starting a part-time job and selling their possessions. Where the two low response were taken a loan from relatives and saving, receiving 24% and 4% response, respectively. From these numbers, it is safe to say that employers in this industry is financially fragile and unprepared to withstand the pandemic. This is indicated by the very low number of employers having enough savings to survive the pandemic. To summarize, these findings were able to answer the second hypothesis, which is the employers are struggling to pay workers on time. Hence, the hypothesis is accepted.
Next, for the research objective number 3, it is to identify the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on the employers in terms of the government aid. This pie chart shows whether or not the business owners receive any government aids. 68% of them received the government aid incentive, while 32% of them did not receive the government incentive. This can be due to those small businesses of tourism were in the rural area and they were not exposed to the news. Some might not because of other people telling them, but if there was no one to tell them, then they will not know about it. In addition to that, they might feel that they were not eligible for the government aids, hence not bothering to apply for it first. For those who applied for it, there's a big chance that they were in the city, hence were more likely to expose to the news. The next pie chart shows the percentage of them agreeing or disagree on whether the government aid was enough to cover all their losses. 88% of them agreed that the incentive was not enough. However, there was 16% of them that disagree and in their opinion was enough. Although the government funding are in the billions of Malaysian ringgit for cash aid, however, when it comes to the employees who receive it is not enough to cover the losses they suffered during the pandemic. Despite the government giving aid, recipients think that it is not enough. The government handing out one-off payments are not sustainable when looking at it in the long run. For a certain period of time, the one handout payments seems enough, but it is clearly not enough as the lockdown period keeps lengthening and the amount of lockdowns keep increasing. In their opinion, the government should give longer moratorium period, reduce taxes and ease the bank loan process, and provide more financial aid in terms of cash. In conclusion, for research objective number 3, employees did not receive sufficient financial aid given by the government to cover their losses. The losses they suffered during the period of COVID-19 is more than the government incentives in terms of cash aid. Hence, the third research hypothesis is rejected.
Conclusion: throughout this research study, we have answered our 3 research objectives, which leads us to verifying or refuting our hypothesis claims. From our findings and analysis, the first hypothesis, which is employers are not able to generate any revenue, is verified. For our second hypothesis, which is employers are struggling to pay their workers on time, is also verified. However, for our third hypothesis, which is employers receive sufficient financial aid from the government in the form of cash aid, is refuted. However, in our research study, there are a few limitations which prohibits us from obtaining a much accurate data. This includes the limit of our subject, which is employers, that limits us to only a few potential people in a company. Last is the time constraint, which has affected our ability to conduct interviews with the credible journalists pertaining to this matter for our qualitative study method.